Hello and welcome. It's Brad Laurie speaking, and today we're talking about all things Fetch.AI. To explain this further, we have Toby Simpson. He is the CTO of Fetch.AI. Toby, thank you very much for your time this evening.
That's no problem. It's my pleasure.
Now, mate, obviously you've been speaking with many different parties. A lot of interest is all about Fetch at the moment. It's coming to the fore. Many people want to know more before they can engage in this really exciting time of blockchain. Now, mate, one of the key slogans for your startup is all about adapting the world to you, really reconceptualizing, reframing, and shifting responsibility. But what does it all mean, Toby? What's the fundamental premise behind Fetch.AI?
Yeah, well, I mean, that phrase "adapts the world to you" is really important because it seems increasingly that we're the ones that have to adapt to the world, and you're the one as an individual, you and me. Whenever we try and do anything, we have to figure out how to make it work. We're the ones making the effort. We're the ones going out there and firing up goodness knows how many different apps and trying to coordinate things. I've described it as conducting an orchestra in your digital life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's getting increasingly more complicated. There's more and more moving parts, and you're the one having to do all this stuff. And we sort of thought, you shouldn't. We have the technology and the capability now of making the world adapt to you. No longer is this the case. The world, the digital world around it, should figure out what you need and deliver it to you without you having to make all of the effort. Right. And we think that is a very exciting switch in responsibility.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more so people can understand the real benefits specifically of Fetch, though, Toby, because we hear a lot of discussions about AI, especially with the complexities of it, and it almost confuses many people. So let's bring it down specifically to what you're referencing, the problem itself. When you started this, what was the big problem you saw that you really needed to address, specifically with those terms of automation? Really moving beyond that simple narrative of breaking down those silos.
Actually, this is a story, it's fair to say, one way or the other, has been quite a long time in the making. The other co-founder and I have been talking about ideas on these lines now for well over a decade. And we're looking at all of these moving parts and thinking, well, if we could get, effectively, if we could get the plates to spin themselves, if we could bring all these component parts to life and give them the ability, the autonomy and the authority to get things done on behalf of what they represent, then maybe we'd have a really interesting change in the way all of this stuff actually worked. Now, back then we couldn't figure out how to get the scale of something like that, because if you start creating digital representatives to data and hardware, then you end up with a very big population very quickly. But actually it was decentralized ledger technology. When that came along, we thought, interesting. Now this gives us the scale that we wanted, because now we can have this effectively endless population of these things. And they can have the authority to get things done on your behalf, and they can negotiate with each other to get things done. Now, what's interesting about that is it flips the whole thing from more of a top-down approach to a bottom-up approach. And that means you can take all of the complex parts that are involved in solving problems, and you can take them all apart and reassemble them in different ways according to what individuals want. Now, I mean, this has all sorts of applications, of course. One of them is just generally utilization of assets, because, I mean, look how much data we don't use in comparison to what we do. I mean, it's quite shocking how much we throw away because either we don't know it's there, or to exploit it costs way more than it's worth. If you can attach that stuff to these digital entities and release them into a world that restructures itself in real time to connect people together, then of course you've got something interesting. And from your perspective, it means it's almost like having the red carpet rolled out in front of you wherever you go, right? So for transportation and travel, every time I travel down to London, I have to coordinate goodness knows how many apps in order to figure out what's going on. And if I drop the ball on just one of those, I find myself sitting on a delayed train, or waiting for something that's not going to turn up, or standing there in the rain thinking, I wish I brought my umbrella. And that effort, we want to take that from your shoulders, and we want to give it to all of these digital entities. We want to create this economic internet for the machine-to-machine economy. We want to create an environment that's just for them, for all these digital entities, so that they can find each other, so that they can exchange value, and so that they can do that independently of human intervention to solve these grand complex problems like travel and like energy. And there's a lot in healthcare and supply chains as well, where this kind of approach is really interesting, because you get that robustness, that flexibility, that you wouldn't have if you try and understand and build a solution to a problem from the top down.
Right. So essentially, what you're building, from what I'm hearing, is a system in which you can almost autonomously and also automatically predict outcomes as a machine. So that's where this discussion of machine learning comes into deep learning. Talk us through that and what you plan on doing with the technology, so that people in the public can almost seamlessly interact and not even know that these technologies are really planning and using their environment to determine outcomes before you even make a move.
Well, of course, it's worth wheeling out the Douglas Adams quote from The Salmon of Doubt, when he says that what we're stuck with is technology when what we really want is stuff that works.
Right.
And that's what all of this stuff is really about. Now, you don't want to know that you're using all of these detailed pieces of technology. You want magic to happen. You want it just to get on and solve these problems in a way that doesn't make you curse and swear all the time. You know, we've all done it. We've all sat in front of our computer swearing at an inanimate piece of software because it's not doing what it should do. And whilst it might make us feel better, of course, it doesn't achieve anything because software isn't conscious. It can't sit. You know, Microsoft Word doesn't think, oh, he's upset. Do you know what? I'm not going to crash this afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, none of these things are the way it works. And a lot of what we want to achieve is reliant on effective predictions. It's not what happened that's interesting, it's what will happen or might happen. And when you're planning complicated things, particularly think travel is, I mean, I come back to it, but it's a great example because there are so many moving parts and they do all have to mesh with each other and they aren't all connected. And the tiniest thing can change. You want those predictions. You want to know what will happen, and you want that information to be presented to you in a way and in time for it to be useful. Now, AI and machine learning, well, machine learning, of course, as a part of the overall umbrella of AI, they have achieved some amazing things with some of these approaches about pattern recognition and learning how this stuff works and then presenting it to people. What we want to be able to do is to collectively build knowledge and predictive abilities and then provide that to all of these digital entities so that they can get things done on the basis of what will happen. And that can dramatically increase the user experience, particularly when it comes to travel, when you're told, leave the office now because, well, you know, it's going to be great. But if you wait 5 minutes, it probably won't be.
Right.
And kind of information at your fingertips and delivered to you without you having to constantly check something in order to find out is actually really interesting.
Sure. So it's almost, in a sense, an infrastructure for predicting, outcomes, utilizing data being the fundamental asset as well. So again, the applications for that, in a sense of verticals, is really quite endless. And you must be excited about how this can evolve in various sectors, whether that be enterprise, whether that be from government adoption, from the lay sectors, as you mentioned, from the grassroots up. There's a lot of potential for development in this field, but you're that infrastructure for application.
Yes, I mean, this is why we describe ourselves as this sort of economic internet, that you've got all of these digital entities, these digital representatives, and we're connecting them to a network that is learning in real time how best to connect something that has value to something that wants that value or might want that value. So it's not just an understanding of all of the market intersections from the top down, it's the ability to spontaneously learn and develop and introduce based on new market opportunities. And that kind of semantic view of a world like this is really attractive, particularly if that knowledge is a collective part of the network available to everyone, as opposed to been stuck in individual siloed places which can't be shared with other people.
Right. And it makes a lot of sense. You know, this economic internet's a great rationale to really explain sort of the premise and the platform. But let's break it down a bit more into those three layers that you have as well. The first one obviously relates specifically to your automation with the agents specifically built. So talk us through that. How does it work? Why is agency and agents so important with the way in which you've designed these layers?
Well, these are, for a start, the existing global network is designed for human beings, right? It's a human being to connect to get work done. we wanted to build something for machines, so for digital entities to be able to connect to and get stuff done. They would do that potentially on behalf of you, or on behalf of a piece of data, or on behalf of something else, or indeed make decisions on their own behalf. But we wanted to give them the autonomy and the authority to be able to get things done. And that means they should be able to acquire the information that they need, and then potentially package it and process it in different ways, and then move it on to other people. And this is why this whole autonomous economic agents thing is so important. And obviously, we're going to end up with a very, very large population. You don't have to imagine attaching these things to much in the way of hardware and data, or indeed representatives of people, before you're talking about populations in the billions. So you need the underlying infrastructure to be able to support those kind of numbers that are coming and going all the time. And that's a very different problem set to solve than a lot of the other things in this space, in that we're creating this digital world for all of these agents to be able to exchange value. Which is why I sometimes refer to Fetch as the ultimate dating agency for value providers. That we're about connecting and figuring out how to connect the agents that have to the agents that want, and doing that transparently and invisibly behind the scenes in a world that consists of many dimensions: economical, by content, so semantic views, and also geographically, as well as just on a network basis. And
it's almost like you're the agent. You're the agent for this economic internet that you're talking about for the different parties, that you're that hub.
Well, yeah, but of course, one of the things you want to do with something like this is you do not want it to end up in a centralized entity. You want
That's a good point.
To be purely owned by those that use it and entirely decentralized. And I guess one of the advantages that we have with Fetch is that there is a built-in incentive to decentralize the network further. Because there's only a finite number of agents that can connect to any given node in a network like that. So as the population goes up, so does the need to create nodes in order to service those agents, to provide them with the view on the world, the knowledge and the ability to be able to find other agents that they can trade with. And that's an important part of that, because as well as providing that connectivity to all of those agents, the more nodes and computers that you have connected to the network, the more computing power you have to be able to solve problems.
Right.
And this is what we do with we call it synergetic computing, the idea that you can do these decentralized computing tasks on the network, so on ledger processing, quite advanced processing. This includes machine learning as well as other aspects of AI, and use that kind of processing to solve some of these really big problems that people on the network want. I mean, a great example is the traveling salesman problem, right? How to optimize a route in order to minimize time taken and fuel used and effort, but to maximize your ability to deliver everything where it should be. How does that work when it's not just one, where you've got tens of thousands of things? And what happens if they're delivering different things and swapping stuff between each other? This becomes a very complex processing problem very quickly. But it's also a problem that can be parallelized, and it's one that can be distributed across all the nodes of the network as part of this synergetic computing, as a service available for all of those that want it. So we're very excited about having that kind of computing power available as well, because it's an availability of computing power that's absolutely fantastic for doing all sorts of aspects of AI that can be divided up into component parts and solved in that way.
Right. Well, obviously, compounded with that is the way in which you've addressed your consensus as well. You've built in usability as a key feature of that. So talk us through how the way in which your consensus mechanism really affords for a more scalable approach, something in which, it can almost synchronize with the way in which you're addressing machine learning for the needs of this global scale that you need to have for, real use case.
Yeah, so I mean, actually, this is, of course, this is a whole massive subject over all sorts of different bits. So firstly, we needed to be able to create a scalable ledger, and we needed to be sure that because you see a lot of people in this space saying, okay, I can do 50,000 transactions a second, I can do 100,000 transactions a second, and you have to ask them why.
Right.
I mean, that's great, but why? Whereas we started from the point that, well, in order to solve this problem, in order to be able to support this number of agents all getting their stuff done, we're going to need to be able to support these kind of transaction rates. But more importantly, we can't just have it cap out at a certain level where we have absolutely no idea how we would grow it further, because otherwise you're immediately creating a cap on the number of agents that can ever exist without any real idea how you're going to solve that problem. And that's a really dangerous position to be in. And one of the problems that we needed to solve was how to make that scalable and how we would design our ledger in order to do that, and which we did. And one of the things that is part of that is this ability to be able to do things in parallel. You know, the easiest way to double the performance of blockchain is to have two of them next to each other, right? But you've still got the issue then of how you synchronize across all of those and how you arrange them and deal with cross-chain transactions. And it turns out, actually, if you end up with potentially hundreds of those, that you've got quite a complex processing problem in figuring out how to arrange cross-chain transactions so that they don't mess each other up. This, interestingly, led us to this useful proof of work aspect of Fetch, where we could get nodes to effectively solve the puzzle to pack and stack the transactions, potentially out of order, in order to fill gaps where they didn't tread on each other, to optimize the throughput of that. It's kind of like a weird magical Tetris game. And it owes a lot to the idea that in modern CPUs, they have this thing called out-of-order instruction execution, right? In order to make the best possible use of all the parts in the CPU, you might pull an instruction from the future to now, because you know you can execute it now without affecting any of these other ones, but it means you can use all the parts of the processor.
Right.
And the ability to do all of this stuff out of order, but figure out how to do it in a way they don't collide, is quite interesting. And that's one aspect of useful proof of work. We also had to solve a number of other problems. We have a system that is an incentive-compatible proof-of-stake mechanism. We operate on this philosophy of minimal agency, which is the idea that we don't want individual component parts of the network to have too much power. No one node on the network should have the ability to control what goes on. That stuff is really dangerous. You want a network that is open to everybody, and anybody who connects, any node that connects, is able to take part in this process. Otherwise, you have a tendency to push towards centralization, which you really don't want.
So not only decentralization, but democracy is built into the staking system through this other consensus mechanism.
And that's super important. And we have this thing we call a notarized DAG, which connects blocks together, which it sort of gives us the ability or the capabilities of having some kind of centralized controller, but in a decentralized way. And that also means that it can scale, because the moment you have any central entity involved in something like this, then you have a big scalability problem that you can't just keep adding to it without worrying how you're going to scale those top-down elements that exist in your architecture.
Right.
But there was another part of this, that in order to do all of this computing, we wanted to be able to do useful computing on the ledger. And that involves being able to do machine learning stuff on there, and to be able to do all of these programs and split them up across the network to be able to solve big, complicated problems, and for all of that to hold together. And that amongst all the other things, was why we ended up having to create so much of our own technology for this, because there is nothing out there that can solve all of this. But then we're setting out to solve a very different problem. We're trying to create this huge decentralized environment for all of these agents to find each other and get useful work done on behalf of who it is that they represent. So that's how we ended up building our own ledger and our own virtual machine and our own language for doing all of that, and our own consensus mechanism in order to ensure that all of that held together.
Right. Just to jump in there, so it's important, I think, that people understand just how the challenge inherent in building something like this is, and the fact that you tackled all of it. I mean, as you mentioned, you've done the VM, your own VM, your own language. I mean, this is harping back to the things of Ethereum. The first iteration of building out these very complex structures. You've addressed it. You're trying to do it. You've got a dual consensus mechanism system. But I guess the big thing that you did build that relates to the smart ledger is your open economic framework as well. You mentioned before of this economic internet. So let's go there as one of those key aspects or key core features of your three. How does that interrelate with what we're talking about now with consensus and with the ledger itself?
Well, one way of looking at the open economic framework is the eyes and ears and the ability to touch the world as given to the agents. It's the agent's ability to connect to the decentralized environment, find other agents and get stuff done. It's that higher level component that sits on top of all of this. Now, it fundamentally requires and uses all of the computing that takes place on the ledger and of course, spreads all of its information out on a decentralized network whose integrity only exists because we've got these decentralized ledger technologies underpinning it. But it provides that high level view for agents. So they can connect to a world, and they can be very simple, these agents. I mean, if you've just got something that's stuck in a weather station in your back garden, it may consist of a few lines of code, and it may just plug itself into the network and say, I've got this. And then wait for the network to say, oh, actually, this agent would quite like that. And then you can get things done. Alternatively, these agents might be quite big. They might connect to this world and they might use the open economic framework to build a huge picture of what it is that they can see in a certain direction, for example. You might gain a view that combines a semantic view with a geographic view. So you might sort of look from one city towards another for things relating to healthcare. Or you might try and say, okay, I'm standing in transportation and I'm looking towards healthcare. What kind of marketplaces do I intersect? And that kind of ability, because this is the great thing in a digital world, unlike the real world where we all have to see it from a different perspective because, well, we're humans and we've got eyes. A digital world, no such restriction exists. You can look at this world on multiple dimensions and combine all of those things so that the view you get is highly tailored to you. And this is what the OEF was all about. If you've got a world of billions of agents, you don't want to get a list of billions of agents to process. You want to get just the ones that are relevant to you.
Right. So just to jump in there so we understand, it's about optimizing for that user. It's optimizing the data to suit the needs of that person or that user or that actor in the space. Utilizing the technology to do it, which is your technology.
Absolutely. But it's important to note that that user is not necessarily a human user. It can also be a machine user.
Okay.
You may have an agent that, for example, represents a big junction on a road somewhere that is buying up relatively cheap sensor information from people who are walking by, vehicles that are going by, and it's using that to build a picture of what's going on. It's combining that with some various aspects of AI, including machine learning, to build a predictive model so that you can ask this agent, well, what's the situation going to be at 3:30 this afternoon? And it can combine its knowledge with all the data it's buying up live in order to provide you with that prediction.
Right.
Now,
in that sense, as you mentioned, because it can be machines essentially as clients, that opens up a huge scope for potential in interest for enterprise and government sectors, I would imagine, in that sense, Toby, because many of them would be looking for technology that can drive this facility, for bettering current models of, software that can essentially improve outcomes technologically, socially for different verticals.
And on many different layers as well. A shipping container knows whether it's empty or not, but it can't do anything about it. And one of the interesting conversations to have with people is over asset management. And I was having a chat with someone who said, well, if I work in a lab and I'm looking for a certain kind of a microscope, so I send an email around saying, has anybody got one of these? Because they're quite expensive and we really wouldn't want to buy one. And you don't get any replies. So eventually you buy one of these things, and the very next day you're in the cafe having a cup of tea, and someone says, oh, you should have asked me. I've got 3 of them. It's like, what? How does that help me now?
Right. Again, it harks back to those silos, that problem, which is your system all interlinked.
But if you can stick autonomous economic agents in those devices, then they know where they are. They also know where they should be.
Right.
And this is when you have conversations about construction sites or hospitals. Sometimes hospitals lose patients. let alone pieces of equipment. These are big, complicated places with lots of things all rushing around. And if you can represent them with autonomous economic agents, then these things know where they are, they know what they're doing, they know where they should be, and they're able to contact who it is that they need to contact to say, I should be here, move me, or you need me right now, and this is where I am. And that kind of thing, it reduces wastage. And that means that the assets that you've got get used more effectively. And it was the same conversation we had with construction sites. They say, well, it only takes somebody to park something in the wrong place, and it's a week before we can find it, particularly on large infrastructure projects. And okay, you can stick GPS things in all these things and try and build a map, but then you've got to try and figure all this out. But actually, those pieces of kit know where they are.
Right.
And able to break, as you were suggesting, that idea that you can break down all of these silos. You take this one, and that one, allow them all to work together. Then one area can suddenly use the assets of another area far more effectively.
Right.
And that produces a huge amount of wastage in the economy.
And Toby, that's where it harks back to your analogy of the economic internet, because it essentially creates a convergence of value as well, because once again, that interaction is the imperative. And I would imagine that's where your narrative as Fetch.AI comes into play with the statement of transforming the data industry. So talk us through that. What's the sentiment there? What does it mean to say that you are literally transforming data?
Well, data is dumb, as we all know, right? And I'll have many conversations, and one particularly notable one, well over a year ago now, from a data warehouse, where the guy said to me, he said, my problem, Toby, is that data doesn't get up on its own 2 feet and sell itself. And as a result of that, he said, if I want to sell some data, I have to get on an aeroplane. I fly somewhere. I sit in a room with an alarming number of lawyers, and then 2 or 3 months later, we've got enough paperwork to build a table out of, and we eventually sign a deal. And he said, great. He said, you can rest assured, unless that data is worth an unbelievably large amount of money, I'm not even getting in the car to the airport, let alone doing it. He said, all that value data that might be useful, that's wasted. And that's the problem with data. It's not the data we do use that's interesting, it's the data that we don't. And that is getting worse every day. We've got more and more and more data in this data economy. It's coming in from everywhere. But who's to know what's useful and what's not useful? And it's really difficult as a human being from the top down to try and figure that stuff out and how to get the best usage of all that data and get the value out of it. Because in the end, you can't scale that understanding of what it is that you have.
And it's interesting you say that, because all the current blockchain startups that I do speak with, the narrative is very strong that the real value is data itself. We're in this data economy right now, and you're right at the forefront, being one in which you're trying to predict outcomes, being that data leader for everyone and everything, literally, as a machine who's going to interact in these ecosystems.
Yep, and that's the cool thing of a multi-agent system in this case, where you've got no real limit to the population of agents, that you can stick an agent on every item of that data and you can dump it on the network and let Fetch figure out collectively, in a decentralized collective intelligence way, who should be talking to who in order to exchange that value. It's cost you virtually nothing to do that. In fact, it pretty much has probably cost you nothing to do that. You have a big box of agents ready to go. You've got your data, you connect them all together and you put them on the network. The ones that are gaining value from that data, well, you can create a bigger population of them and you can put them out onto the network. But the great thing is you're not having to worry about figuring out who the customer is for this data, or who might be able to use it, because the network's learning and it's finding the non-obvious ones, because that's what's kind of interesting, right? That actually this piece of data can be used by these people who you'd never have imagined would be interested in that data, just because the network has learned using various aspects of machine learning that actually at this time, under these circumstances, this group of agents tends to like the value that it can get from this kind of data. And you are that kind of data. I mean, these are machine learning techniques like, for example, embeddings, where you can vectorize knowledge and figure out where it sits in relationship to each other by how near it is in a reduced dimensional space. And this is what's interesting about creating these different views in the world, that it brings all of this data that would otherwise have been wasted into play, because a lot of it has a shelf life. And that data that you don't use right now is worthless tomorrow. And when you can get it onto a network quickly like this that can scale to handle it, then that you're less likely to have your data going out of date and not being used. More of it can be used to solve problems. And that's kind of exciting, that we've got all this data out there, we've got all this hardware out there, and that actually, if you attach it to an autonomous economic agent, you put it in this massive multi-agent system that Fetch is, that it will take care of figuring out who should be talking to who at any given moment.
Right, so multi-agent's really exciting because it involves the personal machine. The interesting point you made also is the fact that there's an aspect of valorization or value for the participants and those actors. And when people are involved, as one example, that is quite exciting because, again, this new model of DLT affords also nuances of incentives for them to be part of this. So I want to talk about that in the context of real world for a moment. Talk us through some examples. You know, we alluded to some in verticals, but really bring it home because the AI particularly is quite complex and quite convoluted in discussions in the blockchain arena right now. But I want to break it down so that people can understand how it would look, how it would exist in the real world, especially for someone who perhaps may not know anything about the technology itself.
Well, an example I use often is if a whole bunch of people on the street in London suddenly put their phones away at the same time, chances are it's just started raining.
Right.
I mean, obviously it rains a lot, it's London, but that's actually really useful information. And it might be to me at that exact moment because I'm debating whether or not I'm going to walk from Embankment all the way up to King's Cross because I like the exercise, or whether or not I should pop into the tube. And having that information delivered directly to me is potentially extremely valuable. Now, one of the things that we have at the moment is all of that utility value that you carry around with you every day in a mobile device that's in your pocket is not utility value that comes to you. It goes elsewhere, and even then, not in a particularly effective and highly utilized way.
Or a transparent way. Sometimes, as we know from Cambridge Analytica.
Absolutely, and all of that really alludes to the fact that your data is less and less in your control, and that kind of stuff is a very long philosophical conversation, to say the least. And one of the things that blockchain does, as has been said on many occasions, is it moves power and control from the centers of the network to the outside. And you are on that outside. The idea that the value that you contain and that you control can be potentially value that comes to you is really attractive, because suddenly it means that you're controlling all of that. And of course, when you combine all these cryptographic technologies, you get identity. You get these things called verifiable claims, where you can prove that certain things are true without having to leak a huge amount of data. But more importantly, asserting those claims is something that you do and you control, and you're the one that has them. Unlike the example that you go into a bank and open a bank account and you pass all of their know your customer and money laundering checks, and you give them all of everything related to all of that, and then you walk next door and open a savings account in a different bank, and they need to do the whole thing again.
Exactly.
It's a ludicrous waste of resources and time and effort. That the actual claim, the ability to show that you have done that, is not in your control and cannot be transferred. So that's one of the things that all of this potentially means in the long term, that the utility that you contain and you carry around with you in a vehicle and your mobile device is value that will come directly to you.
Right.
And because you have a network that's figuring out how to make better use of that, then in the end, the value that other people's utility delivers can be connected through to you as well, without the intermediaries that are there. And this is one of the things that's interesting about technology like this, that in the end, it changes the role of intermediaries in the economy, because it connects the value provider, the person that has it, directly, which again is interesting in travel, because the reason why we find travel, particularly those that don't do it on a regular basis, so incredibly stressful. There's just so much to organize and so many things to go wrong. And that's the reason why we like websites that join all of this stuff together and take some of the pain out of this process. But in the meanwhile, the individual bits at the outside, like the actual hotel and things like that, are not in a position to be able to communicate with you their individuality directly.
And that's a good
And then
analogy. That's a great analogy just to jump in for what you are more on a universal scale. Because, if we look at these travel sites, we all love to travel. Well, you alluded to some that don't, but, those who, even those who don't probably would like to if it wasn't so challenging. And what you're doing is really that on a larger scale, because you're bringing all of the components together, again, using that analogy of convergence as well. So that, again, another one would be the brain, looking at the neurons, lighting the whole brain itself up, not just isolated neural activity, so that the whole system can work. That's essentially what you're doing. But at a data level, at a truly scalable or automized data system, you can be likened again back to that travel analogy, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. And every single one of those individual components is, for want of a better phrase, alive in its own right. This is a big pile of dumb data. This is a pile of digital representatives of data and hardware, things, people, infrastructure, and services that are capable of making decisions on their own behalf without human intervention.
Right. And it's almost like you're creating a D-web. Sorry to interrupt, but it's almost like you're creating a D-web, a decentralized web of data, in a true sense of a web, because all webs are interconnected.
And making it a giant Lego set. One of the things that's really interesting about that bottom-up approach is that you can take apart something and you can reassemble it in different ways. When you build a thing to do a thing, that's much harder because you can't cut it up and reassemble it, because you built a thing from the top down to do a thing. But when you've got this large population of moving parts, then it can shift and adapt in real time. Now, this is interesting when we've had conversations about the energy market and where that will go in the future. Regardless of your beliefs, personal beliefs as to whether or not battery-powered electric cars will be a big thing or not, what they actually mean in the short term is that a large number of batteries have been connected potentially to the grid. Now, those are storage devices. Why shouldn't I boil my kettle off my neighbor's car? Because he doesn't need that bit of power because he's gone on holiday or has taken the day off. But he's charged that thing up over the last 2 or 3 days off a solar panel on the roof. That ability to be able to manage all of these things locally with autonomous agents trading with each other, saying, I need this power now, where can I get it from? And then there's a multi-party negotiation that takes place, and you discover that actually this person can give it to you very, very cost effectively. Now, that's a decentralization of that as well. And it actually introduces robustness into a network in the same way that you don't stand on one ant and find the whole thing going wrong. They distribute the work of doing these things on many component parts without these individual component parts being in charge. And you get that emergent complexity, that emergent ability to solve problems that comes out of it.
Right.
And that to us is enormously exciting.
Sure, but let's talk about, in that sense, let's discuss what's in it for Fetch.AI though. Because obviously, we're discussing something that's technologically innovative. It's going to benefit the vast populations of the world because of the implications of making interactions more programmed, more valuable to the participants, because you can have a system that can predict how we can optimize our behavior and the behavior of machines. But what's in it for Fetch, though, in terms of sustainable business models? How are you going to enable the entity itself to survive if you're just simply, a technology for the people, as an open source?
First things first, you can design and release an open internet and still make money building applications on it, as those that did. And that in the end, we all recognize that if a technology like this is centralized or controlled by one entity for profit, then it's never going to fly. Why would you risk so much on something like that, which is out of your control? So none of that makes sense. So of course, it has to be it has to be open source. It has to be owned collectively by everybody who's using it, and there can't be a central entity who can switch it off and switch it on.
Right.
Otherwise, none of that works. Now, of course, as the creators of the technology, we know how it works. As well as having the non-profit part of the organization, which acts as the foundation and governs and grows that ecosystem and develops that software ongoing for the benefit of all. We make money by building agents for people and using this technology and delivering all of these things, and looking at how the Fetch network can help people. So there's a whole
in many respects, it's a bit like Linux, in that Linux provides that open source, but they also enable development on top of that protocol, on top of the capacity that offering to the globe.
We're absolutely not going to be the only people doing that either. When you introduce all of the different applications that can be built, and the potential benefit of plugging things that are currently underutilized into the Fetch network to see what extra value you can get out of them.
Right.
That's inspiring developers to think what they can do with a technology like that is going to be a key part of this.
So talk us through those things. I mean, will there be licensing, or will there be some sort of how will you have that model, that business model component, where you have clients, for example, or you build your own digital applications? How is that going to play out?
And it may well be that in some cases, particularly some healthcare-related cases, where you might actually deploy a private Fetch network in organizations like that. And that, you can even see that from an internet perspective, the difference between an intranet and an internet. That sometimes there is a need to have an internal internet which connects to the main network in order to get the benefits of doing that and the exchange of value across those barriers. But sometimes, and certainly healthcare is a great example of where there are certain aspects of confidentiality and privacy and whatever that take place that might require such things. And in cases like that, again, as experts in how all of this works and how to build things on it, we are very, very optimally placed to be able to do all of those things. And we're talking with a great number of commercial partners right now about that very, very thing.
Well, let's start with that. Let's just jump in there. Let's talk about them, because if you're talking with a lot of enterprise partners, what's exciting I'm hearing from you now, Toby, is that you're mentioning the idea of permission networks, those databases, those information hubs that these private entities actually need. They often won't work with you if they can't develop them for their own customized use case. You're explaining because you have your VM, you can do all that. And that sounds great for those who are looking at utility as an investment for the future. But I want to talk to you about those partners, because if that's possible, and you as a CTO are privy to the inner discussions at the boardroom, how are these enterprise discussions going? What is actually happening for Fetch.AI in the boardroom?
Well, certainly the people that we're having these conversations with are people that tend to have problems involving complexity. And that are interested and have been interested in looking at blockchain type technologies in order to address that. We get a lot of this in transportation. I mean, we're members of the trusted Internet of Things group, and also Mobi group, a collection of car manufacturers.
And they aren't small entities either. That's important to add. These are very substantial.
And everybody is in these spaces looking at, well, we've got all this data, we've got all this potential value. We want to be able to increase its utilization. We want to be able to build predictions based on it. We want to figure out if there are ways of allowing people to work together without releasing their confidential information in a way that wouldn't have been possible before.
Sure.
So you find yourself in these conversations because actually technologies like Fetch, when you can, it's the agents that do it. That this isn't just a decentralized ledger and a global truth and a verifiable list of what happened and under what conditions and between who. This is using that ability to provide integrity to create this world that very, very large numbers of agents are connected.
Sure.
And in the end, we think that we'll see increasingly that the benefit of getting most out of Fetch is when those agents from networks of, say, car charging stations or this, that, and whatever, actually connect to the main network, because then the network's got the capability of ensuring that people are connected, or the people that want that value are connected to it at the right time. So those are the areas where conversations are very interesting, because a lot of people are looking at how they can get this utilization, but also as to whether decentralization in a controlled fashion initially, and maybe as these things develop, you worry about a little bit less.
Right.
But how decentralization can allow you to manage some of this complexity.
Sure.
And as as we drown in bigger and more complex networks as time goes on, with more and more bits and pieces connected to them, some way of managing that in a sustainable, growable way is super important.
Right, and obviously, Tobe, they don't want to do it themselves. They're not going to go out and build their own VM and try and engage with their own blockchain, ambitions, because obviously it's a very, very challenging prospect to even start, as you'd know. So moving back again, let's go to enterprise for this discussion, because that really is going to allow people to understand your potential value as you build in as an ecosystem of value as an economic internet. Now, you're going to need clients. Those clients clearly are these partners that you're talking about in some sense. Obviously, in the future, there's going to be a lot more. But I want to try and understand in terms of your roadmap, because you've done your testnet, you did it privately, you've moved into a more public scenario, you're moving towards mainnet, is that right?
Yes, we are. So the mainnet is going to be at the back end of this year, and the private testnet network is becoming increasingly more open. Because we're actually building things on it, and will be a complete full public test network from sort of April onwards, which will allow anybody to be able to connect to that. But we're doing a number of things, because one of the problems, and I know this from building massive multiplayer online games, is that nobody wants to be first into a shared world. Because you turn up, you look around, there's nobody there, and you go, well, this is fascinating, then off you go. Right. In the same way that nobody wants to be put in a world and told they can do anything they want, because they'll just stand there and go, where do I start? And off they go. And when you've got a network that's capable of doing so much for so many, you run the risk of doing a teeny little bit of a lot, but not enough of anything to be useful to anybody. So you do need effectively that critical mass in these areas, so that those individual areas can start cross-pollinating each other and working with each other. The intersections can deliver additional value. And that's why we identified early on that things like travel, from a consumer perspective, is really interesting. That we can show additional value to the consumer immediately, because we can organize these complicated things in a way that makes sense, but also to the actual value providers, the owner of the hotel, or those that specialize in grouping together people that work for luxury or for business or for this or for that. And actually we can start delivering that value very, very quickly in a space that can make a lot of difference to people.
Right. I'm just going to jump in, because you could talk forever, but the thing I wanted to ask you is the point of readiness as well, Tobe. Are you, given that we were alluding to that roadmap, you're now moving to the prospects of mainnet pretty soon, are you actually ready for this engagement with the enterprise and with the potential of other more significant parties, perhaps even our government sectors, to really start to engage with your technology? Yes. I think that's really important, because we want to discuss real utility here, not pre-utility.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you. Been ready for something like this is a big thing. And we've been having these conversations with partners and with other people in this space now, at potential enterprise people, for a very long time, for well over a year. Right. Engaged in these conversations. And as you'll know, we're founding members of this Blockchain for Europe group, which is looking at helping influence policy in the European Union in all of these areas. And we've been involved. That's
a significant point, all of that. I was just going to say that's significant, because you've really consciously waited to make sure that when you hit the mark and when you can engage with the wider crypto economy, that you actually truly have utility. Because you could have listed this earlier, you could have actualized on the blockchain and allowed people to engage on the liquid market and start to play around with your token even, but you didn't. So is that because
that would have been wrong. And it would have been wrong because we still had big questions to answer. And we weren't able to show with extraordinary clarity how all of these components fit together. And it's something that we were talking about earlier, that there's a lot of stuff we've created here. We've created our own ledger, we've created our own VM, we've created our own consensus mechanism, we've done all these big things. And if we'd have started out saying that we're going to do these big things, then it would have been hard to believe. And what if we couldn't? And you get to a point where you've released the code and it's out there and people can download it, they can poke it, they can touch it, they can see for themselves that this is actually the case. There is a private testnet. It does do all of this stuff. And much more importantly, we've been engaging with people quietly, talking to them, working with them, building agents and making all this stuff work. But also from a policy perspective, we've been talking to people at the European Commission, and they are particularly cool about all of this, that they don't want to mess around with innovation. They want to encourage it, and they want to do the right thing. And they want to talk to people who are working in this space. And releasing something like this and building something like Fetch it isn't just a technology play. As you're alluding to in the question, you have to be involved in all of these things. Technology for technology's sake, well, if it's not useful to anybody, if it doesn't get something done that couldn't be done before, if it doesn't generate value, then why? Why would anybody touch it? Okay, so it's technologically, but if it's got no point, then there's no point.
And I really respect the point you're making also, not just also going beyond the technology, but also looking at the time and place in terms of top-down support. It seems like Fetch.AI really hit that right on the head with regard to engaging with the right people, with the right parties, to ensure that you are compliant, you're with the EU. You talked about how there's a lot of support in Europe, for example, with utilities themselves. So surely, it must be exciting that all these elements are aligning to support you as you now enter into this new market.
Oh, it's incredibly exciting, and it's taken a huge amount of effort, and we haven't done it alone. We've had some help from some extraordinary people, and of course we've got an incredible team here that have made all of this happen. But yeah, it's incredibly exciting because now we've actually reached a point where in a very short period from now, people will actually be able to do useful things and build these agents and make this stuff happen on the Fetch network. Yeah, I mean, and it's like we've reached this point now where we can imagine all of these things that people could do on Fetch. We could see all these applications like the Fetch automated travel agent and how it can talk to all of these things. But what we imagine and what other people will imagine when they get hold of it are two completely different things. Much in the same way, I'm fond of using this example that I doubt the Ethereum people saw CryptoKitties coming. And when Apple did the App Store for the first time, there were whole new classes of application that were created by just somebody in a bedroom who was able for the first time in 20 years to take what was in their mind and turn it into an app, and then not have to go and explain to a publisher why they should publish it. They were able to self-publish. And as a result of that, this whole app economy of these things that, again, 10 years ago, we'd never have imagined, is now with us on a daily basis, and we take it for granted. And you create enabling technologies like this, and it means that people suddenly have the ability to take what's going on in their mind. They say, oh, I could get value out of this. Oh, I could attach an agent to that. We don't know what people are going to do and what they're going to try. And that's part of the excitement of that, building this community and working with people and seeing what they're building and seeing this whole thing grow and getting to a point where we're going to be able to see all of that happen is extraordinary.
Well, it is exciting. I need to jump in there and ask you, you say it's coming soon and you used all these little hooks to get us interested, but tell us exactly when. Let's go to a more specific time scale and plan. When are these things going to actualize? For example, if we talk about developers being able to interact, if we talk about people being able to really start to engage if they want to be a client, for example, or interact from that sector, how and when is that going to happen?
Yeah, sorry, I had a habit of using words like soon without actually quantifying what it meant. Okay, well, the token sale is on the 25th of February.
Okay, so 25th of Feb, public sale.
Yeah, that's right. And you will be able to use the ERC20 tokens that are from that in order to partake in utility on the network. So that's what we mean by a by invite test network. At that point, you will be able to use those tokens to use the network participation app. You will be able to use them to create test tokens on the test network, the test, effectively the test mainnet, in order to be able to build agents, to generate, to search via the OEF, to build pictures of the world, to get things done. So all of that utility, which is important that an agent needs to be able to exercise in order to be able to find and transact and work with other agents, will all be possible. But you don't need to be a developer in order to be able to do this. The network participation app we're particularly pleased with, because that's a drag and drop thing. On your mobile phone, you can create an agency, or have a bit of this, a bit of that, a bit of that, and make an agent there and then out of the sensors and let it go onto the test network. And we've got a whole population of buyer agents and other things that are out there as we're learning how all of this works, how all these multi-party negotiations work between agents. And that provides this rich source of data that's out there for people to build other agents to work with.
I see. So there's a whole range of different participants, and there's a whole range of parties who want to and can use it. But there's two things I need to ask you. One of them is a speculator. In that sense, obviously, that's always going to be part of this, given that there are going to be exchanges that can engage with your token. How are you dealing with that? Because they aren't the parties that want to use you for utility.
Yeah, and this is a complicated part of all of this, and it's a big problem, and you can't magic that kind of stuff away. If people take the token and decide that they're going to hold on to it for whatever reason that they've got for doing so, there's not much that we can do about that. We've created a network where fundamentally you need to use the token in order to get anything done on the network. So it has an immediate use, in that if you're creating agents, you're building value, and you're generating value from these agents, then you need these tokens in order to be able to build the picture of the world, to connect to the world, in order to do all of this stuff.
Sure, so but just to jump in for a second, is it fair to say though, Toby, my apologies for jumping in, this is just some questions that I'm sure that the community would like to know. If they are treating it, for example, as a speculative instrument of value, which some do, then is it fair to say also, given that you are emerging as a true utility, that as you start to be actualized in the ecosystem you're building, as different parties in this multi-party system start to use the token as it's designed for, is it fair to assume that the value itself of these units of account, of these true vouchers of value, are going to correlate with the growth of your ecosystem? Is that the speculative? Is it fair to say that the token itself, this voucher of value, is likely to correlate with your overall ecosystem growth? The reason I ask is because that's what some speculators are banking on when they do that, well-known thing of hodling.
Yes, absolutely. And any given amount of utility that you can get from a token is going to change over time. And again, that's one of the things that just happens. And whether or not it's any consolation to people to understand that we've spent the best part of more than a year now doing very, very detailed economic modeling to ensure that all the incentives and the feedback mechanisms are in place to ensure that this works, and the fact that we are aware that there is that is going to be the case, and we need to ensure that things like the right circulating supply of tokens at any given moment allows all of these utility operations to be performed, and that all of it's been done in extraordinary and sometimes excruciating. I get flashbacks to spreadsheets sometimes of how we've worked all of this stuff out, and it comes back to an earlier conversation where none of this stuff exists in isolation. When we were just saying just back there, technology doesn't exist in just for technology's sake. You can't exist without all these commercial partners. You can't exist without all the advisors. You need all the legal teams, but also you need to with all the economists and all of these things in order to ensure that you've modeled all this out correctly, that the utility that you desire is going to be possible by all the users of the network, particularly given looking at such a large population of individual component parts that need that utility. If it was just the users, it'd be less of a problem, but it isn't. We've got these autonomous economic agents, and all of these agents will need a token supply in order to be able to acquire what they need, and also they'll end up with tokens as a result of delivering what they have.
Right, and just to jump in as well, I mean, what you're saying is that you've done the due diligence rigorously to make sure that this is going to work, and it's important you mentioned that, because quite simply, there's a lot that didn't do that. There's a lot that still is very much pegged to other platforms, to other economic models, and they are literally moving almost in concert with others. So is it fair to say that as you emerge, you are going to be independent, you're going to be decoupled, and you're going to function as an independent ecosystem with its own marker of value?
Yeah, we need to. That's absolutely vital for something like this. And you can't create, as we've been referring to, an economic internet without being decoupled from all these other things. Otherwise, you can't operate independently. But much more importantly, your own feedback loops and incentive systems are no longer able to fully control the mechanisms by which they work. It's essential that these models build all that out and show that can happen. Otherwise, you never have all of the individual component parts necessary to make something like Fetch work.
Absolutely. Well, talk us now. You're the CTO. Be brave. Come on, Tobe. Cough it up. Give us some of the names. What are some of these companies? I'm assuming you've got some NDAs and you can't disclose a lot, but give us some clear examples now of the kind of companies, the kind of scope, and the kind of size of these companies at the very least that are working with you, that literally are going to use your token and really build this out for their own interests.
Well, we actually did build something for a company called Cluster Markets, looking at putting autonomous economic agents in medical equipment in order to ensure that they operate effectively. And we built that, and it works. And we did that some time ago. When you look at TIOTA and also Moby and all the different partners involved, it doesn't take an enormous amount of investigation to figure out the kind of people that we're talking to when it comes to sensors and the car industry. And looking at what we can attach to them. And we're part of some very, very interesting things that are going on that demonstrate all of this, that are happening over the next month or two, where actual Fetch agents are inside vehicles and attached to sensors and delivering value that will be shown and presented to the world at large by all of the partners that are involved in that, which includes us. And that kind of stuff is very, very exciting. And also looking at the different stuff we're working with is a couple of individual hospitals, working with a university on looking about how Fetch agents can optimize power usage and heat storage, and potentially make better use of all the data that they have, because they have a huge amount of information about where everybody is at any given time. And potentially using our synergetic computing platform, you can assure that you don't have just one meeting in one building at 2 o'clock in the morning, meaning you have to switch the lights and the heats on for the whole thing.
Right. So Tobe, these are obviously substantial parties. You're talking to a lot of different people. When will you disclose this to the public? When will we start to see the rollout of information of these partnerships that obviously aren't small and that are a key to the beginning?
And all of that is happening right now and pretty much every week for goodness knows how long into the future. All this is happening up to the token sale. It's happening beyond. We are with a fully public test network in April. There will be a great number of agents there that have been created and put there by these partners as part of development. So there'll be a lot to see, and we're as anxious to talk about all of these things in
yes,
detail.
I'm feeling that.
But it shows that Fetch can be used to actually do useful things, and that's really important, which is why we're presenting with these partners.
And is it just the beginning though? You know, Todd, that's the sense I'm getting, because, you know, you talk about the token sale, but really this is the beginning of a utility. Do you think that this is going to actually accelerate rather than slow down after the token sale, because you have this utility now accessible and real and for the developers as well?
And, you know, we believe that with a passion. And that's why we got into this, because we're very much wanting and will create this system, because it's something that one way or the other has been on our minds for a decade as to how we'd be able to do this. And now everything is aligned, and all the technology, or the enabling technology, was available to allow us to do it, and now we've done it. And now it's going to be out there, and people can build this stuff with it.
Well, talk us through how though, and how is a developer going to be able to do this easily? Is the interface simple? Is the information accessible? The GitHub, is it all ready?
Yes, GitHub's there now, and right now, since about September, August last year, when we released the scalable ledger code, we are doing our day-to-day work in private GitHub and snapshotting across to a public one on a regular basis. Now, we've been doing that because we're moving all the architectural pieces around so often that it wouldn't give anybody a stable platform to work from unless we had milestone releases. But now everything has come together. We're flipping our internal private development into the fully public GitHub. So everybody will be able to see. And this is from, we're planning on doing this in the next week, so before the token sale.
Right.
And people will be able to see all of the individual developers that are working on our team and all of their commits. But it also allows people to contribute and offer suggestions and take part in all of that themselves. But that code has been available some time, and since last year, you've been able to download the ledger, the VM, the OEF, and you've been able to build it and actually develop agents. And you can develop agents in a variety of different languages. We've built SDKs for Python and for C++. We've also got HTTP, sort of simple web interfaces that can be hit by JavaScript and websites to be able to communicate with the ledger and with the OEF2, which we're about to be releasing, and that's how our network participation app works.
Right.
That's drag and drop ability to create agents. We want this to be open to everybody. We know, as you do, every single barrier or step that you put in place between somebody's bright idea and their ability to make it happen, you will lose people.
Right.
So we have to make it trivially easy. And that's particularly the case, incidentally, going back to our data conversation, with people who've got large warehouses of interesting data. If it's not as easy as going click, done, walk away, to create an agent to represent it, then they won't. It has to be effective, zero cost. It has to be automatable. You have to be able to have a box full of agents ready to go to automatically attach them to data and release them to the network.
Sure.
And then see which ones are working and which ones aren't.
Well, talk us through the interface then in that sense as well, Toby, because you've made it clear that the developers can now access the code. It's been available. I would assume that developers have already been using this and building. Is that fair to say so far?
Yes.
Okay. So how is that anyway? How are the numbers with regard to the kinds of development, the numbers of developments and applications being built?
Well, it's relatively limited because with the private network, people who are doing work that is connected to that private network, it's been very much a case of by invite only. And whilst we're aware that a number of people have looked at the code and messed around with it and built a few things, we're not really aware of the details. Okay. One of the things again happening coming up to the token sale is releasing our community website. This is a key step for us because we know that engaging and building and working with the developer community is going to be really very, very, very important for making Fetch a success. And when you look at successful developer communities in this space, like everybody who's working on the Ethereum platform, you look at the sheer numbers of those people, and the community around them, and what it is that they achieve and they do and they talk about, you look at something like that and you think, yes, of course, we need to be able to have that kind of environment for Fetch developers. And the community website means that that's access to documentation, that's access to the team, that's access to each other, the ability to build and deploy and test and work with. And that's a really important part of all of this. But also, of course, your usual hackathons, and all of the meetups and interacting directly with the developer community, both through our community website and also in person at all of these things. And we've got a number of those planned this year as well.
Right. And you raise a very important point because you valorize, or rather you value the whole social aspect of crypto. You understand that everything hinges on these narratives of belief and trust in a trustless system. Because again, we see, for want of a better term, we see camps, emerging where there are people genuinely supporting the ethos of Ethereum because of what it stands for. So talk us through, just how you've approached this strategy. What's your go-to engagement strategy so that you really support the community as they support you?
Well, we look at people who do this very, very successfully. For example, the DirectX team at Microsoft, they're developer evangelists, the people who are out there flying the flag, interacting and engaging with developers, whether they're small or big, and doing so on a continuous basis to ensure that everybody has the support that they need in order to get things done is a great example. And they're not alone. There are other people that get this right, and in a decentralized way as well. The Ethereum guys have done this very, very well.
Now, if we hark back to the public sale coming on the 25th of Feb, now you're going to need some sort of good wallet system as well. Have you got that ready?
Okay, well, the initial token, of course, is ERC20. So those that have ERC20 capable wallets are able to hold the token. We've built quite an extensive amount of behind-the-scenes infrastructure so that those with the ERC20 token are able to generate test tokens on the main test network. We've built a wallet app on the test network, which will be released as well. And we've built the network participation app, which is one way that everybody, regardless of whether they're a programmer or not, can see what happens when you try and utilize the utility that's in your devices and release those agents onto a network and see how that can be done. So we've got a whole pile of things that we've got ready to go on that front.
Sure. Now, there's a lot to do. I mean, obviously, you've well and truly mapped out the plan. You've been doing this for quite some time now, building up to the utility release for the public. But I want to talk about that in the sense of the raise and really understand how you've built in the metrics, why you have it there. Let's start a little bit with explain to the public how much you raised so far, what the plan is for how much you want to raise in this public offering as well. Let's really explore this really transparently.
Okay, and all of the details relating to that are expected to be published in the next 24 hours. So I can't release.
Now I appreciate that. When I publish this, they'll be up because it will take me some time.
Of course. So of course you'll be able to either put that on the screen, whatever.
I will.
And that's all happening very, very soon. It has to, because of course that all has to be in place for everybody to see prior to the public sale. You can't do that without all that information. And we've been working very, very hard to make sure that all that data is correct, fully transparent. Everybody can go through and they can check all of this stuff. So we've done an existing tokenomics paper, which is about to be updated to make sure that that reflects any of the changes that have happened up until now. The money that we've raised to date through a private sale, and that's been used to fund the development of the technology. And when you create a company and you've got 40 world-class developers and economists and other people, you need all the offices, all the legals, all the other associated costs with running a business. This stuff costs money. But actually, if you sit there with a calculator and you work all that out, you see that Fetch has delivered incredible value for money.
Right. And I want to jump in there for a moment. So you've had a pre-sale. You're going to disclose all this information. What I did want to know is two very important things. Firstly is, did you cash out some of those funds that you raised so that you had strong amounts of capital? And did you put in lockups for those people like yourselves, for example, as the team, and the investors, the partners that really supported you from the outset? Obviously, they're going to receive benefits because of that early entry and that support, but are those tokens locked for them so that they can't simply dump? That's the other part that I wanted to find out.
Absolutely, and they are, and all of the details of those lockups are published already in the tokenomics paper, and that's been available since last summer.
Right.
There have been no significant changes to those things since then. In fact, the only changes really are beneficial to the individuals. All of that. We know that this is a tough one to get right. And in the end, you need the support of the early investors.
Sure, and I don't mean to push it, but the reason is because obviously, Toby, we saw the ICO problems that really plague the industry because of the corruption, because of all of the quick pumping and dumping and exit strategies for some.
Yeah. I mean, certainly ask people to look at the tokenomics paper and to look at all those lockup values, particularly those relating to the team and the investors and the foundation and ecosystem development and everything else, and judge for themselves how we've got that set up. We think that it's fair. We think that it reflects, along with our actions in the past, our commitment to been in this for the long term. And we think that's reflected in the partners that we've worked with, the people who've supported us, such as Outlier Ventures, for example, that we're in this because we're trying to do something amazing, and we're trying to converge a whole pile of interesting technologies in order to solve a problem.
Sure. But can I ask though, why now? Why release it, so close to the public sale? Why not just have it published well and truly before? Because surely a lot of that information wouldn't have changed for some time, given that the initial investors, have been around for a while.
You know as well as I do that the last sort of 9 to 10 months, or indeed the last year, one way or the other, has been a really interesting place
Right.
in the whole space, right? Things have gone up, things have gone down.
Mm.
And they went up further than everybody thought, and they went down further than everybody thought. And that means that you're standing on a wobbling, moving floor. And when it comes to doing economic modeling and figuring out exactly how many tokens and at what price, in order to ensure that all the things that we were talking about actually work,
right.
What you can't do is cement all that in, carve it in stone, and stick it up and say it will be this way. Mm-hmm. Because then everything that you rely on, all those assumptions that you rely on in order to make that work, suddenly change. And that's why this is complicated, because in the end, you've got all of these stakeholders, you've got all these people, we've got the early people who got involved as early investors. They are people who enabled all of this, and we need to do the right thing for all of them, even though the market has been challenging. And we also, as you were saying, there's this issue of what happens if you get the lockup periods wrong and people decide to dump these tokens. Right. And that's not what we either. We're trying to create this thriving ecosystem where people can use these tokens to get the utility on the network, to get stuff done. And that's not going to happen if we don't get this right.
Sure.
So it's not possible to agree on those numbers and be 100% sure on them way, way, way in advance. Although I would say that if you compare the tokenomics paper that we published last summer with the changes that will happen with the updated version prior to the token sale, you will find that there are really not that many changes.
Okay.
It's just a few of the key numbers and assumptions which we couldn't possibly have known because we didn't know what the value of certain things were going to be.
Right, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate that you are going to release this soon. But let's talk about now the runway itself and your funds. Did you cash out? You mentioned, you alluded to this volatility in the market with regard to any funds that you previously raised.
Yes, because in the end, you have to cash out in order to be able to, we're sitting in an office with...
sure, but some didn't. That's why I asked.
And unless you do so, and you never quite know what's going to happen in this space, right? And everybody has got this wonderful benefit of hindsight where you look back and say, well, I'd have done this. Well, would you? Right. And when you know what's happened in the market, it's very easy to look back and imagine that you would have done things differently. But in the end, of course, we had to, because...
Well, that's good to know. It's good to know.
You never know what's going to happen in the space. You don't know how far things are going to go down. And when you're working with something like this, you want to make sure you can deliver it.
Absolutely.
And you can't do that on fumes and fresh air.
Absolutely. Well, look, talk about the public sale for a moment, Tobe. Can you give us some numbers of how much you anticipate to raise? I mean, obviously, it's going to be released anyway. We might as well discuss that.
That information is due out literally any moment.
All right.
We're looking at a raise of an appropriate amount to ensure that we would have the runway necessary to get to MainNet and beyond. And build the value in the Fetch ecosystem and work with the commercial partners and have that space, that flexibility and that contingency to be able to get things done. This isn't about being hugely greedy either. This is about having what is appropriate to give people the confidence that we have the appropriate runway to be able to get where we want to be and far enough beyond it to allow for life surprises.
I'm glad you said that, because obviously the narrative coming forth is all about utility, making sure all the funds really support that plan, to maintain it, to build it, to strengthen it. But I also wanted to discuss, the investors themselves, because we've talked about some Spark Labs, Blockchain Europe, Mobi, Token Market, Uledger, IoT Alliance. These are all key partners or investors. But the two I want to talk to you about is Binance and Outlier Ventures. And the reason is because obviously you mentioned them a few times and I've read into them. Outlier Ventures are renowned throughout blockchain for being exemplary in terms of trying to really build out a true holistic approach, not just a quick grab for, in VC dollars. And then on the other side of it is Binance is very well known for being a prominent exchange, leading in volume. So how key are those two entities for your success?
Well, they're the best. And Outlier are fantastic. And as you said, they've got this holistic approach to this thing. And that's absolutely true. That really is the case. And they understand deeply and passionately that these technologies do not exist in isolation.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting is when you start converging all of these things in interesting ways, and then potentially creating all of these and supporting all of these entities that can then overlap in some slight way in order to be able to benefit each other in ways that weren't possible. And that very much comes back to my sort of Lego set view of life, where if you can take the pieces apart in real time and reassemble them in interesting ways to do bigger and grander things, then you have something very interesting. And they truly understand that. They've been in this space for a very, very long time, working with people who care very, very deeply about what it is that they're working on and what it is that they're delivering.
Right.
And it's been a great pleasure and a great privilege to work with them and have their support in this process. And I think that it's given us access to an incredible wealth of knowledge and information, and an ability to get those sort of checkpoints on what it is that we're doing, and also these incredible ideas about how we might be able to deploy Fetch and work with other people that we wouldn't have otherwise realized.
Right, and I also noticed Tobe, that in the portfolio that Outlier Ventures represent, there's also, as we were alluding to, many different components or verticals that they've really touched upon to build out this holistic position that they hold. And one of them, another one we were discussing earlier pre-interview, was sovereign. So one of the things that's interesting is that many of the different components arguably would also align with you in the future as well, potentially.
Yes, you see, sovereign particularly, it's a great example. Their work with identity and verifiable claims is potentially really interesting. Yeah. And when you start looking about how you might, well, in fact, I would say potentially, it is very interesting. The potential bit is when combined with Fetch, right? That you might have agents that, depending on the certification the other agent presented, might get different levels of service. So people from one agency or another agency, or that can prove X, Y, or Z, might get specific information, but others may get aggregated information from an agent. And the ability to be able to, for an agent to be able to understand and prove different aspects about the people that, or the other agents that it's talking to, in order to decide what kind of level of service to provide is really interesting. Particularly when it comes to all their aspects of identity as well. Right. And that there are a great number of those, and Outlier have been, as you've seen, have picked some very, very interesting organizations to support and work with that have those specialized areas. And when you look at them and you stand up and you look down, you think, yes, you can see that there are these little overlaps here and there where they can help each other, and if you combine them, you get something very interesting out of it.
Right, now let's move across to the connection, even from Outliers. We noticed that recently they attended the Binance conference in Singapore. There was a lot of buzz actually about Outliers.
Yeah, I was there too.
Right, well, you would have seen it firsthand. There was a lot of discussion. And in that sense, Binance, seemed to really warm very quickly to the kind of ethos that Outliers presented, and no doubt you. Is it a real asset to have Binance, given that they have the monopoly on volume, given that they're almost an essential part of the entire ecosystem to exist and to continue? You must be excited, that the launchpad is there.
Absolutely, and again, it has been, to use the phrase again, it's been an extraordinary privilege and great pleasure to work with everybody at Binance as well. They're top of this field, and they understand what is going on here and what they're doing to promote this entire ecosystem and make it more accessible to everybody. Is beneficial to all of us, absolutely all of us. and their excitement and enthusiasm, infectious enthusiasm for everything that's going on in this space can't help but rub off on people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're in a space where it wasn't that long ago that it was almost impossible for a mere mortal to get anything useful done, because you trip over terminology that didn't make sense, didn't mean anything. And suddenly you've got one of these bitcoins or something that you didn't really understand why you had it, and then you lost your private key and now you don't have it anymore. And it was confusing, and it's alarming for people, and it doesn't feel very comforting or very welcoming and very safe, and it keeps people out of the ecosystem. And, you know, much as everybody has things to say about CryptoKitties, and this will be the second time I've mentioned it, this discussion, what it did do is suddenly force a whole load of people to figure out how to get into the Ethereum space. But they had to figure it out, and it was tough. Right. And when you people like Binance in this space, breaking down these barriers and making it easier to get involved and to get connected and to start doing this stuff and interacting with these things, that can only be a good thing for all of us.
Right. Well, let's talk about, though, in the context of Monopoly, to play the devil's advocate, because obviously you'd appreciate we're in a distributed and very much decentralized ecosystem, or one that is building on that framework and ethos. So do you think that, you know, Binance, given that it does have a monopoly, that it's a good thing, or are you hoping that we evolve into a more distributed and decentralized series of DEXs? What's your position on that?
Well, I don't think they would describe themselves as a monopoly, but I guess that's something you'd have to ask them. Right. There are a great number of players in this field, and they all do different things that are important. And anybody who's in this space breaking down the barriers and making it easier for people to get involved in all these decentralized technologies, that's great for us all. Sure. And particularly those that are valuing the technology and paying close attention to what has been developed and supporting those new ecosystems and bringing them to people, that's got value as well. Right. And from our perspective, this is how we get tokens into people's hands so that they can take part in the whole Fetch.AI thing, and they can build agents and do stuff. And it's fantastic to be able to have that resource available to us.
Sure, and I think you raised the good, most important point, and that is the whole premise to utilize Binance is to enable as much as the possibility and prospect of utility for as many people through distribution that's fair, that's vast through the launchpad. But I need to ask you about fees. Now, one of the quotes I recently read on Twitter was that Binance tend not to charge the top class, you know, the best in class, as it was said in the tweet, with regards to startups. So did you have to pay a high fee to list with Binance?
We haven't made any announcements whatsoever about listing at the moment. What we've been talking about and what we're doing right now is a token sale.
Sure. Okay. Nice and safe. But hopefully we'll find out a bit more about that, because quite simply, you know, there is an understanding out there that there is a variance in the way the costs associated with listing with Binance, and hopefully, you know, that becomes more transparent for all different parties, not just with Fetch.AI. Now, if we could talk about exchanges in the future as well, Toby, because obviously this is just the beginning for you. Have you mapped out in any way the exchanges coming forth for Fetch.AI?
And to repeat the nice and safe but wholly undesirable answer from your perspective again, we at this stage, all we're able to talk about is the fact that there is a token sale, and that we've got nothing to say about whether or not these things will be listed in any way, shape, or form at any time in the future.
Assertive and disappointing.
Yeah, well, you know, obviously there is a need for people to be able to get hold of Fetch tokens, and particularly once there is a main network, the value that they generate inside the Fetch ecosystem will need to come out in some way.
Right. Can we at least say you have a plan, though, Tobe, beyond Binance? So
obviously, if we build a big concrete wall around Fetch and say none shall come in and none shall go out, then that really doesn't make the Fetch ecosystem work. So I think we can.
So you have a plan. I'm reading between the lines. What about competitors as well? Obviously, we've talked about so much, and we've got a few things to cover. No doubt you are aware of the AI space. We already know of some blockchain startups that are utilizing machine learning, deep learning, and they're doing so in the real world with real partnerships. As you mentioned, hospitals, some of them are doing it. Certainly in China, there's some leading ones. Is it even an issue? Is it even a competitor? Or is there plenty of room in this space?
Well, firstly, there is plenty of room in this space. You know, I mean, we are just, we're a decade in to this whole thing. And to say that I think that collectively we've scratched the surface only and nothing else is an understatement. I mean, we've barely started yet.
Right.
You know, those people that were poking around with the internet, or even before it was called the internet, in the 80s and 90s, knew that they were sitting on a technology that was fundamentally going to change everybody's lives, but couldn't tell you how, or in precisely what way. And yet here we are today with a whole bunch of things that nobody could possibly imagine. We're in this space now with all of this. Everybody's looking at decentralization and saying, okay, well, this is cool. We can get scalability. We can get access to a huge amount of computing power. We can connect things together that we wouldn't otherwise be able to connect together. That means we can do interesting stuff. And they're looking at AI and thinking, ooh, what if people who had AI solutions could easily find other people who wanted those AI solutions? And so it goes. So while there are a lot of people who we potentially intersect with in some way, I don't think that we're all directly competing with each other, because we're doing different things. And we set out to build this world for autonomous economic agents. And our usage of machine learning and AI is enabling it in the agents to provide prediction services, but also enabling it in the OEF to be able to act as that effective dating agency where we can connect the agents together so that they can get stuff done.
Right. And just harping back, sure, and just harping back to the token itself, is it fair to say that it's a compulsory unit of account as well? You can't simply just, utilize it without the token. It really genuinely does drive the whole thing.
Because in the end, it's fundamentally part of achieving integrity on a decentralized network, that the incentive mechanisms are there to ensure that the people do the right thing, and that poor and bad behavior is actively discouraged, and that you can reach agreement on a global state when no one person is in charge. Well, that means that unit of value exchange is part of the fundamental process that enables that to happen.
Sure, absolutely.
It's also the method by which, therefore, that you would deliver those tokens in order to get the utility that the agents require from the nodes, like building a picture of the world around them, performing certain kinds of value exchanges, moving around from one thing to another. Because in the same way that you pay gas fees on smart contracts related to the amount of computing power you're using, we have the equivalent. You pay gas fees depending on the kind of computing power that you do. And if the search that you're doing to build, say, a cone image in the semantic space of transport north of you by 100 kilometers involves, I don't know, 20 or 30 nodes all performing some computing and sending information back to you, then that's a lot of computing power you're kicking off, and cover that. And that's the utility that you need to have access to, and that's that then goes to the individual nodes for providing those services to you.
Right. Well, obviously, to do all of this, to make all of this work, you need a killer team. You need one that's going to have the experience and the skill sets, and even in business, you need one. You have, interestingly, a CEO that is an entrepreneur that's had a lot of business experience. That's not necessarily unusual in the traditional sector, but it is a little bit in blockchain, because often we see teams trying to even forge some semblance of strength. Has it been a marker of strength to have that as the lead when you have such a strong, as you mentioned, 40 plus team of engineers and qualified people behind him?
Absolutely. And Hermione and I have known each other now for coming up to 15 years, I think. And he was involved as an investor in DeepMind, which was acquired by Google. I was one of the first people through the door at DeepMind, looking at how potentially biologically inspired AI might help in the journey that they were taking. So one way or the other, Hermione and I have been talking about what we could potentially do with really scalable systems for a long time. So we came into this already knowing what it was like to work together, and already having that vision and that dream. And we've been incredibly fortunate to have assembled such an extraordinary team around us. and all of these people with their incredible experience that spans an extraordinary number of years. Of course, all that, because it hasn't just been magicked out of nowhere, is there for people to poke around and check. You can look at the patents that people have attached to their names. You can look at the computer games and everything else that say I worked on over the years. And you can look at what it is that Hamayan has done, and every single one of the highly talented people in this building, you look at their record, and we've been incredibly open about all of that because we're incredibly proud that we have these people here.
Right. And has your team been growing? Considering it's the bear market as well, and I apologise to interrupt, but has the team been expanding despite many teams actually downsizing?
It has. We have been expanding, and we continue to do so. We have more people starting over the coming weeks in front of us. And in the end, you don't take something like Fetch and slow down in order to speed up. We want to deliver this vision, and when we get the right people that come along that we can get involved in delivering that vision, of course we get them involved in doing so.
Right.
Expanding to make sure that we can deliver on what it is that we've said we can deliver.
Right.
And actually, everybody getting involved, everybody who is going to be taking part in the token sale, who's going to be taking these tokens and building agents or connecting to the network or watching it or examining it or downloading and using the network participation app and messing around with all these other bits and pieces, all of those people want to know, and I guess this comes back also to your runway question earlier, that not only is that this a team that's appropriately funded, but it has the right people and the resources, be them people resources, access to advisors and everything else in order to be able to deliver this.
Right. Well, in sync with that, you also need to have a system that's global. Now, your team, does come from different parts of the world, but compliance is also a very complex area, and it's a contentious one at that, because you mentioned that you're okay in Europe. You've got a very pro-blockchain and pro-crypto, in fact, or pro-utility, I should say, system in place with the EU, certainly leading the way and supporting. But what about the rest of the world? What are you doing to make sure that not only do you have a functional utility, but it will work in those jurisdictions?
Well, obviously there are some jurisdictions that for regulatory reasons can't take part in the token sale, and we receive all of the advice about all of that, and that's just the way it is at this stage. And we've got advisors, and we've got people that we know and that we work with who have a knowledge of different areas of the world better than we do. And we take any and every opportunity to engage with the regulatory authorities in all of these jurisdictions in order to work with them. Because in the end, one of the things that we have established is that people look at these technologies and say, yes, okay, these are really cool technologies. In an ideal world, we would create a scenario where these technologies can grow and grow with us, so that all the revenues generated as a result of taxes in these things, but also all of the skills that you grow and you foster in your jurisdiction, all of these things can actually happen. So we have found that people are very open to having these conversations. They actually want to do so, and they want to do so for the right reasons. And that this is something that we would never miss the opportunity to engage in, where we get the chance to do so. And of course, we're actively trying to do so as well.
So which countries can't actually take part in the public sale for us, Tobe? Let us know. Just generally, is the US precluded from this?
Yes, it is. And there's a whole list of all these. I'm never going to remember them all off the top of my head, so I'm not even going to try.
So that's on the website, obviously.
That's that's there. It's a complete list. It's very clear, and all of that is caught in on all the checks.
Okay. And I only ask you this, like, once again, my apologies for interrupting, just for so we can get through everything. But the reason I ask is because obviously right now, if you're considering the token sale that's coming up, make sure you do check that website, but also make sure you do your due diligence. It's important you understand what a utility is. But with that in mind, do you think that in the future, we're going to see a real change from regions like the US? Are they actually potentially behind in the game of utility offerings, of the way in which other countries are really taking hold and taking this seriously and taking the reins?
Yeah, I think that it's a maturing space, and we're all collectively been showered in new things that we don't fully understand and expected to understand them suddenly. And that's going to take some time, and that's going to have its ups and downs along the way. And I think that's to be expected. Regulation in particular always is behind innovation. And you do actually want a gap between the two. Because when regulation catches up with innovation, then it can very easily and accidentally and unintentionally act as the sort of glue in the wheels of progress.
Sure.
Because they can trip each other over when they're still not really knowing what it is that it is all about. So you do need a situation where these discussions are taking place, and they are evolving ones. And particularly from my discussions with the European Commission, the EU, they know, and they've said this, that this is a space that's moving really, really fast. And if they work on the usual basis that they would work on for, say, a regulation in some other field, then by the time they've got the first draft out, the whole world's moved on. Everything has to change in the pace that it works in here.
Right.
And really, the goal is to provide a safer place for everybody who's involved to get things done. And that's not just the people who are creating the technology, that's those that are engaged in acquiring the tokens, those that are building things on it, every aspect of it. They're just trying to make these things safer for all the parties involved. And sometimes that's clarity, but it's also recognizing that what's clear tomorrow and what might be clear in a year's time when things have changed are two different things. So as an actual answer to your question with the US in particular, I would imagine, but I don't know off the top of my head, that these are conversations that are going on continuously in order to ensure that those that are innovating in this space over there are able to continue to do so.
You make an absolutely good point, and hopefully they do so. I mean, the Silicon Valley is a prominent technological hub of the entire world, so surely they are trying to reduce the potential of stifling this innovation, as you were mentioning.
Absolutely, and there are different ways that people in other industries work with all of this. So, for example, in the energy business, when they're looking at changing the way in which regulations work there, they create these regulatory sandboxes.
Right.
So they'll create an area around a town and say, all right, all bets are off. Go and innovate, do all the cool things that you want to do, but you can't because regulations trip you up. And then we'll watch all that, we'll work with you, we'll engage with you, and we'll learn, and we'll use that knowledge to evolve the regulations of the future. So little ones, like for example, in some energy regulation, if you are a battery and you're releasing the battery power to the network, suddenly you're a power generator. Right. And storage and generators have wildly different regulations and requirements, which means that the regulatory requirements on being a power station are so vast that you can't store and release power because it's just too complicated.
Right.
So you need regulatory sandboxes in telecoms, and in energy and in healthcare in order for innovators to be able to try and experiment and work with the regulators in an environment where nobody's going to get hurt, nobody's going to get locked up. So this happens in all sorts of aspects of life in order to make progress.
Sure, and the US has obviously treated this whole pre-assessment as one big sandbox for the future of regulation and everything that is to come. And I appreciate your transparency as well in the way you've approached this, and thank you for making it clear that you are certainly excluding some of those regions that are just simply not ready to participate in this token sale that's coming. Now, you've explained that you have a very serious and real strategy for engagement with the community. What about the socials as well? If people want to engage more with you right now, what social platforms can they go to learn more about Fetch.AI?
Well, of course, there's Telegram. And you can come into the Telegram channel and you can interact with us directly. We're there, we answer questions, we talk to people. I would add the obligatory warning that no admin of the Telegram group will ever initiate a direct message with anybody. We get a lot of people out there who are pretending and impersonating and trying to lift people's money away from them. And that's one of the warnings that we remind people pretty much every hour in the group, but I say it right now anyway.
Right. Okay.
Twitter's a great time, a great opportunity to see when we're speaking places, when we're going places, when we're interacting with people, and what articles we're publishing. And of course, there's our website. Where we're keeping everybody up to date with the news. We've got a fantastic blog where individual developers here and our scientists and our economists are writing posts talking about the work that they're doing and why they're doing it and how it fits into the bigger picture.
Right.
Of course, we've got the upcoming community site, which is where you, as somebody who's interested in developing or looking or poking at what other people are doing, can get involved. And actually look at the developer documentation and help be part of that. And of course, regular meetups and abilities to hackathons to get down there and start poking around and developing with us there. And all of that's happening extensively in the coming months. We did a huge run of that last year, and it was great fun and very exciting to be able to meet people who were interested and talk to people about what they wanted to do and present Fetch, and then have a bit of a social afterwards. So it's
absolutely.
a big thing.
Well, there's a lot coming for you in that sense, Toby, for the whole team. I mean, you've really built out a whole plan. You've had time to do that as you approach this public sale and beyond. And I think that's important to recognize. You're not just doing all of these things rolling out because you're literally going to have this sale. It's because you're literally starting to really evolve as a utility for the future, for decentralized networks as well. Yeah. Now, I want to talk quickly about some criticisms as well, just generally, that have come forth from the community. One of them is the argument that AI is just not ready, that it's too abstract and we need to be more infrastructural. What do you say to those critics that argue that AI is just not, the right time?
Okay, well, I've got two answers to that. One is, yeah, obviously AI is not ready, depending on where you're standing. But on the other hand, AI is ready because it's fundamentally improving everybody's lives on a daily basis, and they don't even know it's happening.
Right.
So AI is a broad field, and it's a bit like saying, it's a bit like just lumping everything in computing into IT and calling it quits.
Yep.
You can't do that. It's not fair. It's too broad a subject. It needs to be divided up. Machine learning is one part of AI, and that's one area that people have got most exposure to, because it's the thing that allows them to find things on Google Maps and allows them to get better medical care and allows them access to things they wouldn't otherwise have access to.
Got it.
Highly trained deep neural networks are doing things for them. It also means it gives you your Alexas of this world, your Siris of this world, your Googles of this world, the people that you can ask. And I watch my kids interact with Siri, and they think that Siri is an actual person. Now,
right.
that natural ability to read something back to you, just that, the ability to look up a Wikipedia article quietly when you ask it what goes on at some thing, and then read it back to you in a natural sounding form. That honestly, the amount of machine learning that is there in order to make that not sound like a 1980s annoying sci-fi computer voice that makes no sense.
It's immense.
That's a huge amount. So that is where machine learning and aspects of AI are delivering every single day in a way that is just seamless to us. So to say AI is not ready is a bit naughty, because it's... Got it.
And I appreciate these nice, short, sharp answers. That's what we're aiming for the finish of the interview. So you've made it clear, you've got to start somewhere, and you're starting now, and it's got to, essentially be done so that we can develop. What about the claim from some that you're using Binance and the launchpad as, means to just enable the pre-investors? Now, we touched on this. We don't have So to enable an exit plan potentially for pre-investors, can you guarantee that that's not going to be possible initially, even though we don't know yet what these...
Of course, I can offer a guarantee in the sense that you can look at the tokenomics paper and you can see what the lockup periods are.
Great. Okay, so that's an absolute guarantee.
You can see that for yourself.
Okay.
But in the end, part of what keeps people attracted to a platform like this is a constant stream of good news and development, and actually delivering things that people can see and touch and play with. Right. And the more that we do in the way of actually delivering the Fetch vision, the stronger that position becomes, and the more that people want to get involved in getting the utility out of that network by building things.
Sure. Right. Got it. Now, what about with regard to the academic aspect and the futuristic components? Some are suggesting that, there's too much focus on that and not enough on the pragmatics. Do you think that in the future you'll also be making these short, sharp educational videos and articles, for example, to really simplify this, to really make sure people understand?
And I think we do, actually. I think we've got a good record of posts that deal in one area of what it is that we're doing and talk about how it works from different perspectives that are on our blog.
Got it.
And we're continuing to do that. And we're getting increasingly, and we make a huge effort to get all of the people that are in this building involved in building those and writing those, because they're the ones that understand their subject areas and how it fits in. So that's a key part of it, and a key part of making it accessible to people and allowing a scenario where people can understand how Fetch can work for them and what it is that can do to make their lives better. Sure.
So education gets a tick there. Now, with regard to token velocity, the token design, the model we were talking about, I mean, have you catered for everything? Have you really looked seriously at the velocity aspect and made sure that for the long term, you've got the best possible system engineered and built in place so that this can be truly viable, truly scalable?
I think that given the experts that we had the pleasure to be able to involve, and the huge complexity of the models that we've built and the simulations that we've run, that we have done everything that we can have done reasonably at this point to ensure that this is going to work, because we really badly want it to actually work. We know that this is a complex economy that we're creating here, this economic internet. There's a huge number of moving parts. There's a lot of feedback loops. There's a lot of incentives that exist here. There's a lot of motivations that different people have for different reasons. And there's a population of agents on top of the population of nodes. We've had to model that very, very carefully. There have been a couple of posts we've made about it. We've got various outputs of a lot of those calculations and processes that are in tokenomics paper and in other discussions. Mm-hmm. And we're going to be releasing an increasingly large amount of information about that, particularly in the way in which the agent economics work. And the incentive models and how all of the details of that really plug in. Like, for example, the very detailed consensus and incentive, the useful proof of work papers that go through all of this. We've got the economics, we've got the agent auctions and how they do multi-party negotiations, how all of that works. All of these things add to how we've considered all of that. And it is a huge part of what we've been doing over the last year. In order to make sure that we've got this as right as we possibly can.
Got it. Well, Toby, it's really been a fascinating discussion, a very lengthy one, but I really appreciate the detail you've gone to, especially given that prospective parties who are currently interested in your utility are looking at the prospect of engaging with this in a more economic sense upon the release with the public sale on the 25th of February. This is certainly valuable information for them. So I do thank you for providing this detail. You just simply cannot get it from anywhere. I certainly can't provide it. I'm not someone who is here to provide financial advice, but my intention is to provide a platform for someone like yourself to be able to relay this to the crypto sphere and for all those people who are interested in Fetch.AI. So I do thank you sincerely. Now, once again, your slogan is all about adapting the world to you. Making sure that there's some sort of system in place that makes it automation, makes data valuable, but in a way that really flips the whole process on its head and makes sure that we as users, as machines, with all of the elements of machine learning, deep learning, and all those things you've explained, can be much more relevant technologically, socially, and economically as you build this economic internet. So it's an exciting time to see this happen. Arguably, there's no better time than the beginnings with innovation at the forefront of a technological revolution. Fetch.AI is a front runner, one of the ones to really watch, arguably, for 2019. And I will be watching. Hopefully, we can have a catch-up or follow-up interview in the future. But until then, I wish you all the very best with you and your team.
Many, many thanks. This has been fantastic.
You're very welcome, mate, and thank you for your time again.